Bitter Montana wind howled through the Cascade foothills like a living thing, rattling the windows of Margaret Maggie Carter's weathered farmhouse and sending snow spiraling against the glass in ghostly patterns. At 74, Maggie had grown accustomed to the harsh winters that gripped the land near Glacier National Forest. But this morning felt different, colder somehow, more urgent. The thermometer outside her kitchen window read -15 degrees, and the world beyond her frost-etched panes looked like a photograph drained of all color except white and gray. She had been dreaming of Henry again. In her sleep, she could still feel his warm hand covering hers, could still hear his gentle voice reading aloud from the morning paper while she prepared breakfast. But the dream shattered when Sonny's frantic barking pierced through the pre-dawn darkness, pulling Maggie from the warm cocoon of memory back into the cold reality of her solitary life. Sonny, her 12-year-old golden retriever, stood at the back door with her hackles raised, whimpering and pawing at the wooden frame with an urgency Maggie had never seen before. The dog's usually calm, amber eyes were wide with distress, and she kept looking back toward the forest edge, then returning to Maggie with what could only be described as pleading. "What is it, girl?" Maggie whispered, her arthritic fingers struggling with the heavy winter coat that had once belonged to Henry. The sleeves hung too long on her diminished frame, but it was the warmest thing she owned. "What's got you so worked up?" Sonny whined again, a sound that seemed to carry more weight than any words could. Without waiting for Maggie to finish bundling up, the dog nosed open the door and bounded into the snow, her golden fur immediately dusted with white crystals. She paused only long enough to ensure Maggie was following before heading toward the tree-line with determined purpose. The snow was deeper than Maggie had expected, reaching nearly to her knees in some places where the wind had created drifts. Each step was a struggle, her boots sinking and sliding as she followed Sonny's tracks through the pristine landscape. The old woodshed sat about 100 yards from the house, nestled against a cluster of towering pines that marked the beginning of the vast wilderness beyond. Henry had built it himself 40 years ago, back when they still heated the house primarily with wood and when their son Michael was young enough to help stack the split logs in neat rows. Now the shed stood mostly forgotten, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow, its contents long since rotted or frozen solid. Maggie couldn't remember the last time she'd had reason to visit it, but Sonny seemed to know exactly where she was going. As they approached the dilapidated structure, Maggie could hear something that made her heart skip, a sound so faint she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. But Sonny heard it, too. Her ears perked forward as she carefully picked her way around the side of the shed to where several loose boards had created a gap in the wall. The whimpering was real. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she peered into the shadowy interior of the shed. There, huddled together in a corner among the ice-covered remnants of old firewood, were three small dark shapes. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than shadows themselves. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she could make out the distinctive rounded ears and compact bodies that could only belong to bear cubs. They were impossibly small, probably no more than a few months old, their black fur matted with frost and ice crystals. Their eyes, when they looked up at her, held a wildness that spoke of their true nature, but also an exhaustion so profound that Maggie felt it in her own bones. The smallest of the three, barely larger than a house cat, was pressed between its siblings, shivering so violently that its entire body seemed to vibrate. Maggie's rational mind immediately began cataloging all the reasons she should walk away. These were wild animals, potentially dangerous, even in their current weakened state. Their mother was likely somewhere nearby, and interfering could put both her and the cubs at risk. The proper thing to do would be to call the wildlife authorities and let them handle the situation. But as she stood there in the biting cold, watching these tiny creatures struggle against the elements that had already claimed so much from her own life, Maggie found herself thinking of all the winters she had endured alone since Henry's passing. She thought of the empty rooms in her house, the silence that had become her constant companion, the way even Sunny seemed to move more quietly these days, as if she too felt the weight of their solitude. Sunny, meanwhile, had approached the cubs with none of Maggie's hesitation. The old retriever lowered her head slowly, her movements gentle and non-threatening, until her black nose was just inches from the smallest cub. For a moment, dog and bear regarded each other in perfect stillness. Then, with infinite tenderness, Sunny touched her nose to the cub's forehead, a gesture so clearly maternal that it brought tears to Maggie's eyes. The cub didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned into the contact, its tiny body relaxing slightly, as if recognizing on some primal level that here was safety. Sunny looked back at Maggie then, her expression unmistakable in its meaning, please. Later, Maggie would wonder what force had moved her in that moment. Perhaps it was the memory of Henry's voice telling her that kindness was never wasted. Or maybe it was simply the recognition of need that transcended species. Whatever the reason, she found herself kneeling in the snow, her hands reaching for the cubs, despite every logical argument against it. The first cub, the smallest one that Sunny had touched, offered no resistance as Maggie gently lifted it from its icy nest. Its body was alarmingly cold, and she could feel its rapid heartbeat against her palm. Without thinking, she opened her coat and tucked the tiny creature against her chest, feeling its desperate need for warmth. Smokey, she whispered, the name coming to her unbidden as she looked down at the cub's soot-colored fur. That's what we'll call you. The second cub was slightly larger, with a white patch on his chest that caught what little light filtered through the shed's broken roof. This one showed more wariness, backing deeper into the corner when Maggie reached for it, but hunger and cold had weakened its resolve. When she finally managed to scoop it up, wrapping it in the scarf she had been wearing, she found herself saying, "Shadow, your shadow." The third cub was the most alert of the group, its dark eyes tracking Maggie's movements with an intelligence that was both endearing and slightly unnerving. It was also the heaviest, solid and compact in a way that suggested it might have been the firstborn. When Maggie lifted it, the cub made a small sound that was almost like a purr, and she smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "And your honey," she murmured, thinking of the golden highlights in its dark fur that reminded her of the wildflower honey Henry used to collect from the hives behind their barn. With all three cubs secured against her body, Maggie began the treacherous journey back to the house. Each step required careful consideration as she navigated the uneven terrain while trying not to jostle her precious cargo. Sunny stayed close beside her, occasionally looking up at the cubs with what Maggie could only interpret as protective concern. The warmth of the farmhouse enveloped them like an embrace when they finally made it through the back door. Maggie's first instinct was to place the cubs near the stone fireplace, where the embers from the previous night's fire still glowed faintly. She quickly built up the flames, then arranged Henry's old wool blankets in a nest-like configuration on the hearth rug. As she settled each cub onto the soft wool, Maggie marveled at how small they truly were. Smokey, the runt of the group, couldn't have weighed more than 3 pounds. Shadow and Honey were perhaps a pound heavier each, but all three were clearly undernourished and suffering from exposure. Their breathing was shallow and rapid, and their body temperatures felt dangerously low. Sunny immediately positioned herself beside the makeshift nest, her body forming a protective barrier between the cubs and the rest of the room. She didn't try to touch them again, seeming to understand that they needed space to recover, but her vigilant posture made it clear that she had appointed herself their guardian. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as Maggie tried to remember everything she had ever learned about caring for orphaned animals. She warmed milk on the stove, testing the temperature repeatedly on her wrist the way she had once done for Michael's bottles. She found old baby bottles in a box in the attic, relics from her son's infancy that she had never been able to throw away, and sterilized them in boiling water. Feeding the cubs proved to be more challenging than she had anticipated. Smokey was too weak to suck properly, and Maggie had to resort to using an eyedropper to get small amounts of milk into the tiny cub's mouth. Shadow was more cooperative, but still struggled with the unfamiliar nipple. Honey, true to the assertive nature he had shown in the shed, latched onto the bottle immediately and drank with an enthusiasm that was both encouraging and heartbreaking. As the day wore on, Maggie found herself falling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Every few hours, she would warm more milk and patiently feed each cub, cleaning their faces afterward with a warm washcloth. She changed their bedding when necessary, marveling at how quickly they seemed to be warming up and gaining strength. By evening, all 3 cubs were more alert, their eyes brighter and their movements less sluggish. Smokey had even managed to drink from a bottle without assistance, though he still required encouragement. Shadow had begun to explore the edges of the blanket nest, sniffing curiously at Sunny's outstretched paw. Honey had discovered that he could make noise by batting at the brass andirons beside the fireplace, a discovery that seemed to delight him immensely. It was then that Maggie realized she needed professional advice. Dr. James Harris had been the veterinarian for every animal on her property for the past 30 years. He had delivered countless calves, treated sick chickens, and had been the one to gently ease Henry's old hunting dog into his final sleep when the time came. If anyone would know what to do about 3 orphan bear cubs, it would be Jim. The phone rang several times before his familiar voice answered, sounding tired but alert. Harris Veterinary. This is Jim. Jim, it's Maggie Carter, she said, glancing over at the cubs who were now sleeping peacefully in their nest. I need your advice about something rather unusual. She explained the morning's events, describing how she had found the cubs and their condition. Jim listened without interruption, though she could hear him making small sounds of concern at various points in her story. Maggie, he said when she finished, you know, I have to tell you that the proper protocol here is to contact the Wildlife Rescue Center in Kalispell. These cubs need to be with people who are trained to handle wild animals. I know that, Jim, Maggie replied, watching as Smokey stirred in his sleep, making tiny mewing sounds. But look outside. This storm isn't going to let up for days, and the roads are already impassable. Even if I wanted to turn them over to the authorities, I couldn't get them there. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jim Harris was not only a veterinarian, but also a practical man who understood the realities of rural Montana life. He had seen plenty of situations where ideal solutions had to give way to immediate necessities. All right, he said finally. If you're going to care for them temporarily, here's what you need to know. For the next 20 minutes, Jim walked Maggie through the basics of caring for orphaned bear cubs. He explained the proper milk formula to use, how often to feed them, and what signs to watch for that might indicate illness or distress. He also warned her about the challenges she would face as the cubs grew larger and stronger. They're going to imprint on you and Sunny, he cautioned. The longer you keep them, the harder it's going to be to release them back into the wild. Bears that become too comfortable with humans rarely survive when they're returned to their natural habitat. Maggie understood the implications of what he was saying. But as she looked at the three small forms sleeping peacefully by her fireplace, she couldn't bring herself to worry about future complications. Right now, these cubs needed care, and she was the only one available to provide it. After hanging up with Jim, Maggie settled into Henry's old recliner with a cup of tea, watching her unexpected house guests as they slept. Sunny had positioned herself so that her head was resting near the cubs, her breathing slow and steady. Every so often, one of the cubs would stir and make a small sound, and Sunny's ears would prick forward, but she never moved from her protective position. As the fire crackled and the wind continued to howl outside, Maggie found herself humming softly an old lullaby that Henry used to sing to Michael when he was small. The melody seemed to soothe the cubs, their breathing becoming even deeper and more relaxed. For the first time in the 3 years since Henry's death, the house didn't feel empty. The silence that had become her constant companion was replaced by the soft sounds of sleeping animals and the comforting presence of life in need of care. As she sat there in the warm glow of the fireplace, Maggie felt something she had almost forgotten, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the old farmhouse, a new chapter was beginning. 3 small lives that might have been lost to the harsh Montana winter were safe and warm, cared for by an unlikely family that had found each other in the most unexpected way. The night stretched ahead, full of uncertainty and challenge, but also full of possibility, and for the first time in years, Maggie Carter was not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The days that followed blurred together in a symphony of feeding schedules, cleaning routines, and the gradual transformation of Maggie's quiet farmhouse into something resembling a wildlife nursery. The storm that had initially trapped them all together continued for nearly a week, dumping 3 feet of snow across the Cascade foothills and making travel impossible even for the most determined rescue vehicles. During those first crucial days, Maggie discovered reserves of energy and patience she hadn't known she still possessed. Every 3 hours, around the clock, she would warm the special formula that Dr. Harris had recommended and carefully feed each cub. Smokey remained the most challenging, his small size making him vulnerable to rapid changes in temperature and requiring extra attention to ensure he was getting enough nutrition. Shadow proved to be the most curious of the 3, often finishing his bottle quickly and then attempting to explore beyond the boundaries of the blanket nest. Honey was the most vocal, expressing his opinions about everything from the temperature of his milk to the softness of his bedding with a range of sounds that varied from contented purrs to indignant squeaks. Sunny had appointed herself as the cubs' primary guardian, rarely leaving their side except for necessary trips outside or to her food bowl. Maggie watched in amazement as the old retriever seemed to understand exactly what each cub needed. When Smokey would shiver despite the warmth of the fire, Sunny would carefully position herself to block any drafts. When Shadow became restless and tried to wander too far from the nest, Sunny would gently herd him back with her nose. And when Honey became overly rambunctious, Sunny would place a calming paw across his back until he settled down. By the end of the first week, the cubs had grown noticeably stronger and more active. Their eyes, which had been dull and listless when Maggie first found them, now sparkled with intelligence and mischief. Their fur had lost the matted, frost-damaged appearance and had begun to show its true, lustrous black color. Most importantly, they had begun to play. It started with small gestures, Smokey batting at a piece of lint that drifted down from the ceiling, Shadow pouncing on his own tail, Honey wrestling with the corner of a blanket. But as their strength increased, so did their boldness. Soon they were tumbling over each other in mock battles, chasing dust motes in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows, and investigating every corner of the living room with the fearless curiosity that was their birthright. Maggie found herself laughing more in those weeks than she had in the entire 3 years since Henry's death. The cubs' antics were endlessly entertaining, from their clumsy attempts to climb onto the furniture to their obvious confusion when they encountered their own reflections in the glass doors of the china cabinet. But it was their interaction with Sunny that truly captured her heart. The old retriever had begun to teach the cubs games that no wild bear had ever learned. She would drop a tennis ball in front of them and demonstrate how to chase it, her tail wagging with encouragement when one of them managed to bat it with a paw. She showed them how to play tug-of-war with an old rope toy, though the cubs' version of the game usually ended with all 3 of them tangled together in a furry heap. Most remarkably, she taught them to fetch, patiently retrieving sticks that the cubs would throw with wild enthusiasm and no particular aim. In return, the cubs seemed to be teaching Sunny skills that no domestic dog had ever needed. Under their influence, she learned to dig elaborate tunnels in the snow outside, creating a network of burrows that served no practical purpose but provided endless entertainment. They showed her how to use her nose to root through the old beehives behind the barn, searching for traces of honey that had long since been consumed or crystallized. And they taught her to track, following the scent trails of rabbits and squirrels around the property with a focus and intensity that reminded Maggie that Sunny, despite her gentle nature, was still a predator at heart. As winter slowly gave way to the first hints of spring, Maggie began to face the reality that Dr. Harris had warned her about. The cubs were growing rapidly, their appetites increasing along with their size and strength. What had once been manageable feeding sessions were becoming more challenging as 3 increasingly large and active bears demanded attention simultaneously. More concerning was their obvious attachment to both her and Sunny. They followed the dog everywhere, treating her as if she were their mother, and they had begun to show signs of distress whenever Maggie left the house, even for short periods. Dr. Harris visited as soon as the roads were passable, bringing with him a wealth of knowledge about bear behavior and a growing concern about the situation Maggie had created. He examined each cub thoroughly, pronouncing them healthy and well cared for. But his expression grew more serious as he watched their interactions with Sunny and Maggie. Their imprinting, he confirmed what Maggie already knew. In their minds, Sunny is their mother, and you're part of their family unit. The longer this continues, the more difficult it's going to be to reintegrate them into the wild. Bears that become too comfortable with humans rarely survive when they're returned to their natural habitat. Maggie nodded, understanding the implications, but not yet ready to face them. How long do we have? Ideally, they should be with a wildlife rehabilitation facility now, Jim replied gently. But practically speaking, you probably have until late summer before it becomes impossible. Once they reach adolescence, their natural instincts will start to conflict with their domesticated behaviors, and that's when they become dangerous. The word dangerous hung in the air between them. Maggie looked at the 3 cubs, who were currently engaged in a spirited game of chase around the coffee table, their movements still awkward and puppy-like. It was difficult to imagine these playful creatures ever becoming a threat, but she trusted Jim's expertise. "What are my options?" she asked. Jim was quiet for a long moment, watching as Honey attempted to climb onto the couch and succeeded only in getting tangled in the throw pillows. "The wildlife center in Kalispell is still the best option," he said finally. "They have the facilities and expertise to gradually reintroduce them to wild behaviors." "But," he paused, seeming to wrestle with something, "but what? There's no guarantee they'll be able to overcome the imprinting. Cubs that have been hand-raised often struggle to survive in the wild, even with the best rehabilitation efforts, and if they can't be successfully released." He didn't need to finish the sentence. That night, as Maggie sat by the fire with the cubs sleeping peacefully around Sonny's protective form, she found herself thinking about choices and consequences. She had acted on impulse when she rescued the cubs, driven by compassion and the immediate need to preserve life. But now she was faced with the long-term implications of that decision. The next morning brought an incident that crystallized her dilemma. Shadow, who had always been the most adventurous of the three, had discovered that he could squeeze through a gap in the back porch railing. While Maggie was preparing breakfast, he had wandered toward the treeline, drawn by some scent or sound that called to his wild nature. It was Sonny who alerted Maggie to the problem, barking with an urgency that sent her running outside without even stopping to put on her coat. She found Shadow about 50 yards into the forest, his leg caught in a steel trap that some hunter had left behind. A cruel reminder that the wilderness held dangers that went beyond natural predators and harsh weather. The sight of the young bear struggling against the metal jaws, blood staining his dark fur, filled Maggie with a rage she hadn't felt since Henry's diagnosis. With strength born of desperation, she pried the trap open, her hands shaking as she carefully extracted Shadow's injured leg. The cub whimpered but didn't struggle, seeming to understand that she was trying to help. As she carried him back to the house, Shadow's blood soaking through her shirt, Maggie made a decision. The forest might be these cubs' natural home, but it was not necessarily a safe one. If the choice was between a life of captivity and a death by human cruelty, she would choose captivity every time. Dr. Harris arrived within an hour of her call, bringing medical supplies and a grim expression. Shadow's injury was serious, but not life-threatening. The trap had damaged muscle and tissue, but had missed the bone. With proper care, he would heal completely, though he would always carry the scars. "This changes things," Jim said as he finished bandaging the wound. "If there are more traps out there, releasing them into this area isn't an option." "Then what do you suggest?" Maggie asked, stroking Shadow's head as he dozed under the influence of pain medication. Jim was quiet for a long time, his weathered hands gentle as he checked the bandage one more time. "There's a middle ground," he said finally. "It's not ideal, but it might be the best solution for everyone involved." He explained his idea, a large, semi-wild enclosure that would allow the cubs to live in a more natural environment while still providing them with the safety and care they needed. It would require significant construction and ongoing maintenance, but it would give them the best chance at a life that honored both their wild nature and their domesticated upbringing. They could learn to be bears during the day, he explained, but still have the security of home at night. It's not perfect, but it might be the compromise that saves their lives. The idea appealed to Maggie on multiple levels. It would allow her to keep the cubs while still respecting their need for a more natural lifestyle. More importantly, it would give them choices. They could embrace their wild instincts within the safety of the enclosure, or they could choose the comfort of the house when they needed it. The construction took most of the spring. Maggie hired a crew of local workers who were intrigued by the unusual project and worked with enthusiasm to create something that had never been attempted in the area before. The enclosure covered nearly 2 acres of mixed forest and meadow behind the farmhouse, surrounded by a fence that was high enough to contain the bears but designed to look as natural as possible. Inside the enclosure, they created a landscape that would challenge and stimulate the cubs' natural instincts. Fallen logs were arranged to encourage climbing and exploration. A small stream was diverted to provide fresh water and opportunities for fishing. Dense brush was left intact to provide hiding places and foraging opportunities. And throughout it all, they scattered the kinds of enrichment activities that would keep intelligent, active bears engaged and entertained. As the enclosure neared completion, Maggie began the gradual process of introducing the cubs to their new environment. At first, they were hesitant to venture far from the gate that connected the enclosure to the yard, preferring to stay close to the familiar territory they had claimed around the house. But as their confidence grew, so did their willingness to explore. Smokey, despite his small size, proved to be an excellent climber, scaling the fallen logs with an agility that amazed Maggie. Shadow, his leg fully healed from the trap incident, became fascinated with the stream, spending hours learning to catch the small fish that Dr. Harris had introduced to the water. Honey discovered a talent for foraging, using his keen nose to locate the treats and food items that Maggie would hide throughout the enclosure. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how they adapted their relationship with Sunny to their new environment. During the day, while they explored and played in the enclosure, Sunny would patrol the perimeter, keeping watch for any potential threats. She had learned to use the small gate that allowed her to move between the yard and the enclosure, and she seemed to understand that her role was now that of a guardian rather than a playmate. In the evenings, however, the old dynamics would reassert themselves. The cubs would return to the house, tired from their day of exploration, and curl up with Sunny in front of the fireplace just as they had during those first weeks. The transition from wild bears to domestic companions happened so naturally that it seemed choreographed. As spring turned to summer, Maggie began to notice changes in Sunny that had nothing to do with the cubs. The old retriever's belly was growing rounder, her appetite was increasing, and she had begun to seek out quiet, secluded spots around the house. When Dr. Harris confirmed what Maggie had begun to suspect, that Sunny was pregnant, the news brought a mixture of joy and concern. "She's getting on in years for her first pregnancy," Jim warned. "We'll need to monitor her closely, especially as she gets closer to her due date." The father was almost certainly Max, the neighbor's golden retriever, who had managed to slip his collar during a visit earlier in the spring. The brief romance had seemed innocent enough at the time, but now it represented a new chapter in the complicated family dynamics that had evolved in Maggie's household. As Sunny's pregnancy progressed, the cubs seemed to sense that something significant was happening. They became more protective of her, positioning themselves around her when she rested and showing unusual gentleness in their interactions with her. Shadow, who had always been the most boisterous of the three, would carefully step around her when she was lying down. Smokey would bring her his favorite toys, dropping them beside her as if offering gifts, and Honey would often rest his large head against her side, as if listening to the life growing within her. Maggie prepared for the birth with the same careful attention she had given to caring for the cubs. She created a comfortable whelping area in the laundry room, lined with clean blankets and equipped with everything Dr. Harris had recommended. She read everything she could find about canine pregnancy and birth, wanting to be prepared for any complications that might arise. When Sunny finally went into labor on a warm June evening, the cubs seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. They positioned themselves outside the laundry room, maintaining a vigil that lasted through the long night. Shadow kept his nose pressed to the crack under the door, monitoring every sound and scent. Honey paced restlessly, his anxiety evident in every movement. Smokey, true to his gentle nature, simply sat quietly, his dark eyes fixed on the door as if he could will everything to go well through sheer concentration. The birth itself was both miraculous and exhausting. Sunny labored for nearly 12 hours, bringing 5 perfect golden puppies into the world. Each arrival was greeted with careful attention from both Sunny and Maggie, who worked together to ensure that the newborns were breathing properly and nursing successfully. But the most remarkable moment came when the cubs were finally allowed into the room to meet their new siblings. Maggie had been concerned about how they would react to the puppies, worried that their predatory instincts might override their affection for Sunny. Instead, she witnessed something that challenged everything she thought she knew about animal behavior. Smokey approached the nest first, moving with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a creature that now weighed nearly 60 pounds. He sniffed each puppy carefully, then began to gently lick them, mimicking Sunny's own cleaning behavior. Shadow and Honey followed his lead, each taking turns to examine and gently groom the newborns. When one of the puppies began to cry, displaced from its mother's warmth by the movement of its siblings, Honey carefully used his nose to nudge it back towards Sunny's belly. When the blankets became tangled around the nursing puppies, Shadow used his claws to carefully rearrange them, creating a more comfortable nest. In the days that followed, the cubs became the most devoted babysitters Maggie had ever seen. They took turns watching over the puppies while Sunny rested, alerting her immediately if one of the babies seemed distressed. They learned to move with extraordinary care around the whelping area, their usual boisterous play replaced by a gentle consideration that seemed to come from some deep understanding of their responsibility. As the puppies grew and began to open their eyes, the cubs' role evolved from protectors to teachers. Smokey, despite being the smallest of the bears, showed infinite patience as the puppies used him as a climbing structure, their tiny claws digging into his thick fur. The puppies, in turn, seemed to regard the bears as very large, very furry, and remarkably gentle siblings. They would tumble and play around the cubs' enormous paws, yelping with delight when a bear would softly bat at them or gently nudge them with their noses. Honey, ever the boisterous one, would often engage the puppies in mock wrestling matches, carefully lowering his head and using his broad snout to roll them playfully across the floor. Shadow, the most observant, would lie quietly, watching the puppies' every move, intervening with a soft growl if their play became too rough or if a pup wandered too far. Maggie often found herself watching the unlikely family, a profound sense of wonder filling her heart. The house, once silent and empty, now buzzed with the joyful chaos of puppies yapping, bears rumbling, and Sunny's contented sighs. Her days were full, no longer marked by the quiet ache of loneliness but by the vibrant energy of a household that defied all conventional norms. Dr. Harris, visiting regularly, would shake his head in disbelief, a wide smile on his face. "I've never seen anything like it, Maggie," he admitted. "You've created something truly unique here." As the puppies grew, so did the challenges of housing bears that were rapidly approaching adolescence. Though the enclosure provided ample space, the cubs' natural instincts were becoming stronger, their wildness more pronounced. Maggie knew that eventually, a decision would have to be made about their long-term future. But for now, as she watched the bear cubs, now nearly yearlings, meticulously grooming the golden puppies and guiding them through their first clumsy explorations of the world. She knew she had done the right thing. She had given them a chance, not just at survival, but at a life filled with connection, learning, and the most unexpected form of family. The story of Maggie, Sunny, and the bear cubs spread beyond the Cascade foothills, drawing the attention of wildlife experts and curious visitors alike. It became a testament to the extraordinary bonds that can form when compassion guides action, and to the enduring spirit of life that thrives even in the harshest of winters. For Maggie, it was more than just a story, it was her life, a vibrant tapestry woven with threads of loss, resilience, and the unforgettable joy of a dog and 3 bear cubs raising puppies together. What do you think was the most surprising aspect of the bears' interactions with the puppies?